Good evening and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Once again, Charlie Banner here from Keating Chambers, taking a break from moving house and being swamped by boxes for the 6th day running. We are delighted to welcome as our guest this evening, Joanna Averley, for I think the 4th time. You're a sucker for punishment, but we're thrilled to have you, Joanna. And of course, you've been hugely busy, you and your team, with reforms to planning, policy, legislation, and all sorts of other things, which we're looking forward to hearing about in Sasha's led interview with you in the second half of the show. You know the format by now, so I'm going to ask you the questions I've asked you several times before. Where are you calling from this evening? And what, if anything, have you chosen to drink this evening and or as a theme, if you've chosen a theme?
Hi, Jolly. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. I am in a windowless room in 2 Marshall Street. If you look very carefully, you might even see some tea splatters on the wall behind me. I didn't find a very inspiring environment, and I'm drinking water. But the theme I've got for you is big numbers. And I'll give you my intro to that. I had a very, very privileged time last week, spending time with some planners actually from all over the Commonwealth, and also people who are looking at urbanisation within cities all over the world. And the big number I give you is 11.8 million. And that is the number of homes that need to be built in India to accommodate the growing population in that country. And I think the thing that struck me about it, in just listening to some of the challenges that colleagues in various parts of the world are dealing with, things like heat in cities, really, really big issue, over 50 degrees potentially, but also dealing with informal settlements, and so places that have grown very, very organically with very little infrastructure. But yet within that context, having to deliver 11.8 million homes. And I think the thought I came away with was, haven't we got it good, actually? And haven't we actually got the means to do this and do it well? It's always really humbling. I mean, met amazing people doing amazing things, but it just puts what we do into perspective, and that we have the tools available to us and the wherewithal. So let's kind of do it well.
Amen to that. Well, looking forward to hearing more of that with your interview with Sasha in the second half of the show. Can I remind viewers, of course, that in lieu of registration fee, we do encourage you to consider making a donation to charity. There's a range of charities we list on our website, wegoplanningnews4you.com, or alternatively, please feel free to make a donation to a charity of your choice. Now, without further ado, I'll introduce the panel, all of whom I was happy to meet in person last week on the magnificent moving celebration of Jonathan Easton's life, which we were all very pleased to be there. Thea, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Charlie. I've got a big number for you. Today I have done a 440-mile round trip to go and see the site in Ipswich. Wow. So that was my big number for today. 8 hours in the car, and I've gone a bit bougie. I'm drinking kombucha. I don't really know what that is. It doesn't really taste that great either, but good. Hello.
I thought you were going to say you'd cycled 440 kilometres, which I wouldn't put past you, actually. But I was going to have a glass of champagne myself, inspired by your champagne, but I forgot to collect it from the fridge before the show started. So sadly, we'll miss out. Now, Sasha, how are you doing? Very nice to see you.
Thank you, Charlie. Yep, very nice to see you. I've crossed the border. I'm in Bonnie, Scotland. On my way to see Rangers tonight. And on Saturday, my beautiful horse, Wise Guy, is running in the Scottish Open in Ayr. So, not the Scottish Open, I'm getting my sports completely conflated. The Scottish Grand National. I hope he isn't running in the Scottish Open.
You were the first horse to win that particular competition.
Yeah, the Scottish Grand National. So
it's probably got as much chance of winning the Scottish Open as he has your race, given your luck with horses. But there we are. Paul, very nice to see you too.
Yeah, so I was making a cup of coffee. That's why I was on mute. Hello, everybody. Hello, Joanna. Thank you for coming back on the show. Yours is a very serious big number. Mine is a very trivial big number, but it does have a Scottish theme. So in terms of the beer, I've got this as the cupboard, which hopefully nobody will recognise. It's called Scottish Beatier Fire, and it is the world's strongest beer, 75% by volume. I am not drinking this. However, I'll send it to Charlie as a celebration for his new house. Cheers, Charlie.
Down in one, mate.
No chance. It's got a warning on it.
Chris, are you also in a windowless room?
I am, yeah, I am. I'm in London, drinking water. No tea splattered over the walls, I don't think. Big numbers. What about the amount of money that has been wiped off world stock exchanges by Mr. Trump? That's probably quite a big number. I'm amazed at India. I've been to India twice for a long period of time. I'd be amazed if they only needed 11 million homes, I could tell you. They've got a population of 1.4 billion, so it won't be 11. And a big number for us would be 6 million homes. That's how many homes I think we need. The French have the same population. If you net off the number of holiday homes, they've got more of those. They have 6 million more homes than us for the same population. Just saying.
Breaking news after that comment: America's imposed a tariff of 754% on Cheltenham. No, we're gonna cut news because actually we want to hear all the news from Joanna in the second half of the show. So we're going to go straight to the case reports. And Thea, you're going to kick off with Milton Keynes, the former Jaipur Orchard Lounge.
I think you know something about this, Charlie. This was an application for the demolition of a vacant 2-storey building in Milton Keynes to be replaced with a 33-storey building comprising commercial floor space on the ground floor, mezzanine level and residential units providing 302 dwellings. And there it is on the screen. You can see it. Guess which one we're talking about. It was an inquiry held by the brilliant David Nicholson and promoted by the almost equally brilliant Charlie Banner, and lasted, as far as I can see, Charlie, for about a day.
Yes.
For reasons I'll explain. So the old building was a former restaurant and bar. You can see that on screen. Now, that was to be demolished. That's the building in front of the Premier Inn. But it was held in high regard by some locals, at least. The scheme was dismissed by the council initially for 6 reasons, including policy conflict with the promotion of the area as a location for major mixed-use office-led development, lack of car parking spaces, character, design and amenity, and lack of affordable housing. So the inquiry got off to a false start in October 2024 when the council submitted additional viability information on the opening day. Charlie, I think you objected to that, as one might expect, but the inspector accepted the evidence and asked the viability witnesses to agree common ground. Again, unsurprisingly, they couldn't do that on the day, and so the inquiry was adjourned until the 4th of March this year. By the time it came back, the parties had reached agreement. There was a revised draft 106 and the council decided not to defend its evidence, advising that the new planning balance meant the appeal should be allowed. So the main issues on the appeal were, first, the objective of promoting central Milton Keynes as a location for business-related knowledge-based activity. And then the provision of parking spaces, including spaces for those with disabilities and for charging electric vehicles, character and appearance of the area, the historic environment, living conditions of future residents with regard to external amenity space. And as to the first issue, the inspector accepted that the scheme would not contribute office floor space, but nor would any be lost. And so that was a policy conflict that was given little weight. And given the sustainable location of the development, the provision of a bond-backed travel plan, and the likelihood that car ownership would be low, little weight was given to the conflict with policy and standards on car parking. On character and appearance, the inspector found that adequate effort had been made to provide active frontages on the most important facades and that the shortcomings should not amount to a reason for dismissal. The inspector also considered that stylistically the building would be in tune with early central business district buildings and therefore would be in keeping with the architectural aesthetic of the location. And again, you can see it there with the Premier Inn behind it. There was a low level of harm to the Grade 2 listed former bus station and the non-designated heritage asset of Station Square, but those harms were outweighed by the public benefits, which included more than £1 million towards off-site affordable housing and also the weight to be given to boosting the supply of housing on brownfield land. Now, on living conditions, that was considered acceptable because although there would be no balconies or specific outdoor spaces for the flats, there would be 2 roof terraces. You can see one of them there. And the site backs onto Grafton Park. Amenity for new residents was therefore acceptable because the design of the flats meant that there was a choice of outlook. They didn't have to look at the Premier Inn if they didn't want to, and very little weight was given to the impact of customers on that hotel, since residents are usually temporary, and the inspector noted that some hotels don't even offer windows, and apparently some office accommodation doesn't offer it either. In conclusion, while identifying some harm, the benefits, especially for off-site affordable housing that could provide much needed family housing in the area, and the use of brownfield land tip the balance in favour of permission. So well done to you, Charlie, and to your team for getting that one home.
Thank you very much, Thea. But without further ado, Paul's going to tell us about the expansion to Luton Airport.
I am Charlie. I'm going to tell you about the decision of the Secretary of State for Transport on the 3rd of April for a proposal where she granted a development consent order for a major expansion of Luton Airport. And I wish I thought about this in advance, because for any viewers that are of my age, I should have a picture of Leonard Rossiter and Lorraine Chase next to me.
I just won my bet.
What, that I mentioned it?
You mentioned Lorraine Chase. Get it.
Luton Airport. So it's issued by the head of transport infrastructure at the planning unit at the DOT. And this is why my big numbers point really comes in. Forget horrible beer. It's this. The decision letter of the Secretary of State is 158 pages long. The examiner's report is 1,132 pages long. The London Luton Airport DCO is 148 pages long. That gives a total of 1,338 pages that Sasha has given me to read for this particular issue. Just to be clear, Dermot McCulloch's History of Christianity, I sit here, is 10% less than that. The 1969 version of Lord of the Rings is 20% less than that. The complete works of Shakespeare, my dad's version of this, is the same length as that. You have given me to read for this particular 5-minute section, Sasha, the same as the complete works of Shakespeare and more than reading the Lord of the Rings. Thanks, mate. Anyway, the proposal was to lift the current expansion of Luton Airport, which is 18 million passengers, to 32 million passengers, to add a couple of taxiways, to add a new terminal, and to add new transport infrastructure. In fact, transport infrastructure that's so expansive, it goes all the way down to junction 10 of the M1, which is literally several miles to the west. The decision of the Secretary of State was contrary to the recommendations of the examining authority. And just to note, the examining authority did the examination from March of 2023 to February of 2024. They took less than a year to examine, but it sat on the Secretary of State's desk for over a year because we had something intervening last July. Happily, I found, after a couple of hours reading, that there is a useful summary of the examining authority's report at page 761. That was a joy. That's just as Frodo's entering Mordor in the other book, by the way, where the examining authority, the inspectors, concluded there would be economic and social benefits for the proposal, but that wasn't outweighed by a range of disbenefits, which include noise, traffic, effects on the Chiltern national landscape, greenhouse gas emission, landscape and visual effects. And also the public benefits did not outweigh the heritage harm. Although they found there were no other reasonable alternatives, the examining authority still recommended that the DCO not be confirmed. But interestingly, there's a whole section afterwards, as there usually is in examining authorities' reports, which dealt with what the Secretary of State should do if she disagreed. And this is quite a lengthy and quite a sensibly well put issue. Well, the Secretary of State did disagree and gave the benefits and harms different weighting and explained that very, very carefully over 158 pages, as you might expect. In wholly unrelated news to the expansion of Luton Airport, yesterday the Prime Minister announced a decision by Universal Studios to promote a new theme park north of Bedford. Within the press release of the Prime Minister highlighted the UK's commitment to its growth agenda and noted how well connected that the new theme park would be, if built, to the new investment, and particularly highlighted the consented expansion of Luton Airport. That's joined up thinking. So the one thing that I would suggest that you draw from this particular decision is just how committed the government is to its growth agenda. So facilitating travel to the proposed theme park is not mentioned in the decision, as you would expect, because it hadn't been announced until afterwards. However, it is worth noting that plainly that's something that's serious and that transcends departments and goes all the way to the Prime Minister. Support for two big schemes in different senses and at different stages of the process within 7 days of each other. The lesson is, do not be afraid to stress the top-end weight to the investment, which would otherwise be given and could outweigh significant harms. The other big feature of this is the first, I think, Secretary of State's decision to grapple with Section 85 of the Countryside Rights of Way Act because of the effect on the Chiltern national landscape, what used to be the AOMV. There's a very closely reasoned part of the decision, and for those of you who don't want to wade through the equivalent of more than this, then it's paragraphs 183 to 219. The conclusion was that there would be an adverse effect upon the national landscape, but how does that then fit into the Section 85 Countryside Rights of Way duty? And that's the duty that was imposed last year that a public body should seek to further the purposes of conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of the AOMB, now national landscape. Well, how was that resolved? Well, if there's an adverse effect upon the national landscape, then the conclusion of the Secretary of State is that's not a legal deal breaker. That's something to weigh in the planning balance. That's the first big thing. That's not new because previous inspectors have said that. And indeed, Mr. Justice Mould said that on a permission renewal hearing a week or two ago. But the big thing, I think, is that the Secretary of State endorsed in that case how it was that the applicant got round that otherwise breach of duty, which was to pay £250,000 payable to the Chilterns Conservation Board, which the Secretary of State considered met the SIL tests and would be paid in order to further schemes by the Chiltern Conservation Board, which would promote the enhancement of the scenic beauty of the national landscape. Now, that's £250,000 for a mega scheme. If you've got a scheme which impacts upon the national landscape to a more limited effect, presumably a more proportionate fee would be payable because every national landscape has its own little board that you can discuss things with. And the Secretary of State had endorsed that as an approach. So two things, really. One, growth agenda, massive amount of weight. Second thing is that there is a way around a Section 85 duty, and that's big. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Paul. And yes, that judgment of Mr. Justice Mould in the New Forest National Park Authority case is definitely worth a read as well for those who want to hear more. Now, Chris is going to tell us about a decision in Christchurch, involves Churchill, which almost certainly means that Sasha White was involved and that he won. Is that so, Chris?
I'm dealing with an appeal which involves Sasha White, and he won. Can I just say that I enjoyed Paul's reference to the Lord of the Rings? I love the fact actually Sam is the real hero of that story.
Oh yeah,
although he didn't have to carry the ring. Right. So I'm dealing with this decision. If we just bring it up, it is a multi-generational community. That's a new phrase on me. I think it means people of different ages, ranging from 55, where most of us are, to not Thea, obviously, to she didn't get the joke either about Lorraine Chase, I noticed, but that's just an endorsement of your age. And yes, Charlie, I know you're younger than me, right? But this is Churchill, which is a name we recognise, but they're calling it intergenerational living, and that becomes important for the sequential test when we get to it a little bit later. It was promoted in Christchurch, and it's 177 open market, affordable and retirement living apartments and some Class E. And the proposal was not on an allocated site, but the development plan was out of date. There's a 2.1 year supply of housing land, and the council area is Christchurch, Poole, and Bournemouth, and collectively they are a huge area, huge population. So the shortfall is 10,397 dwellings, 10,000 home shortfall. And the crucial thing in this case was heritage and flooding. As far as the heritage is concerned, Historic England objected to the proposal, but it wasn't in a conservation area. And the inspector deals with it on a very pragmatic basis, Jonathan Ball. And he takes the view that although it isn't exactly of the quality of design that you find in the conservation area. It was outside it, and it wasn't out of keeping and out of scale. And overall, it was a perfectly acceptable solution for what was a disused eyesore of a site. So just straightforward planning, common sense. Let's get rid of the site as an eyesore and let's put something back. And yes, generally it was all to scale and appropriate. The site is in the town centre, and that's important for the next bit, flooding. The Environment Agency objected to this proposal, a site in the town centre. And just think about that for a minute. We're going to object to sites in a town centre, and we're going to say they shouldn't be built on, which means basically we shouldn't be having the town centre at all. There shouldn't be a town centre because there must be such an extreme flood risk that actually no more development should take place in the town centre. And the reason that's important is because the whole area is subject to flood defences. And the appellant, quite rightly, relied upon the flood defences to say there won't be a significant flood risk. And the Environment Agency and the council said, no, it's in flood zone 3B. And as a consequence, there shouldn't be development. But if you take that approach, how can you redevelop the town centre? It doesn't make any sense at all. The facts are that the Christchurch Bay and Harbour Flood Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, which has got an interesting acronym, prepared by the councils for the area, identified a series of strategy management zones, and this site fell within two zones, 2 and 9 within those strategy management zones. The Lower Arun Flood Defence Scheme was officially introduced on the 25th of September 1998. That's when I started my pupillage with Ian Dove and got told off for being in South America and not coming back quick enough. And it's protected and provides protection in the 1 in 100 year flood event up to 2043. And it's proven completely effective. There is no current need for that flood defence to be refurbished, and the potential need for intervention isn't until 2045 to 2049. And for that reason, the site is perfectly acceptable in terms of its flood risk because the flood defences are there to protect the whole of the town centre. But the Environment Agency still objected, and the council. They called 3 flood experts, and the inspector rejected their case. And he did so on the straightforward common sense basis that we can assume the flood defences are there. It isn't in the functional floodplain. The height of the properties is outside of the flood risk because, of course, the flats are set at a level where they won't flood. And that means partly non-use of the ground floor units because the water would flow through the very lowest parts of the building. As far as the sequential test is concerned, the inspector said, well, it ought to be a town centre site, and it's all part of the same development, this multi-generational community, and therefore I'm not going to disaggregate the parts and try and split it up into smaller sections of 20 or 30 units. And overall, he decides to allow the appeal for what I have to say is just the articulation of common sense. And let's hope when we see the PPG on flooding, it comes out and it embraces a common sense approach, which recognises that the whole of the town centre of Christchurch would be at risk if the flood defences weren't there. So let's not pretend we can't regenerate new sites which need regeneration in the town centre. Also passed the exception test as well. Never quite understood why that's after the sequential test, but there you go. Very, very well done to Sasha's team. I think we've got the list of who they are. But in particular, I think it would be right to say full credit to Amy Hensler, who was your flood risk expert, who saw off the Environment Agency's objection. So well done to Amy, well done to Sasha, well done to the whole team.
Thanks, Chris. And that's a nice segue to hand over to Sasha to introduce more fully Joanna and kick off our interview with her. So over to you, Sash.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Yes, good afternoon, Joanna, and welcome back. I'll let you into a trade secret. I know you're about to have your 5th anniversary in your position as chief planner. We're also about to have our 5th anniversary. With some guests out of the 110 roughly we've had, we sometimes worry about the time and how we will fill it. With you, we did think about having a 6-hour special and turning it into a Lord of the Rings style episode. But no, wiser counsel prevailed and we're going to stick to our normal time of half an hour. But welcome. Just to briefly introduce you, I'm sure you're known very well to most of our guests who are watching. But of course, you are the chief planner and you are frankly, the leading civil servant in England in relation to planning, which is a fundamentally critical role all of us will know. Prior to that, you have had a pretty detailed and varied experience in planning. I'm sure you know our previous guest, Jason Pryor, because you were involved in both the London Olympics and Manchester City Centre, and you'd have come across him. And at the London Olympics, you were Director of Design, and you've also been Deputy CEO of Keynes. So you've been right at the coalface of the importance of design in the past in your professional career. So very welcome. And of course, what we want to talk about today is both the recent past, the present and the future. So could I start off, frankly, by asking you about the past 9 months, and just could you characterise, obviously, July the 7th, we all voted, there was a change of government, and in the past 9 months, there's been a pretty significant changes brought about by the current administration. How has it been from your perspective?
Pretty busy. I always like sort of slightly correcting a barrister, so let me do that first. In the world of the civil service, we have things called spring, summer, autumn and winter. And the reality is I got this job 5 years ago, and then basically it's behind the scenes for the sort of period that I would call lockdown, spring and summer, and then started in earnest in September. So it is pretty much 5 years since I got the job and started working on it, but officially it was actually the autumn. But yeah, my and it's been quite an amazing time and a privilege to be in the role. And I'm always at pains to say, I am part of a very significant team of people within this department, within our arm's length bodies like the Planning Inspectorate and our partners like PAS and Public Practice and all the StatCons. And, I have a privilege of working with many amazing people at my level, above my level and around me. So it ain't just me. And thanks to all of those people. So what's it been like? I think what's really telling about this government, and very clearly a mission-led government, planning is at the heart of the growth mission, the delivery of 1.5 million homes and the delivery of 150 DCOs that we were hearing about earlier, development consent orders within this parliament. So seeing the totality of the planning system to be about homes, neighbourhoods, towns, economy, the journey towards a greener economy as well, and many more things besides. And as you could imagine, it's been quite a busy time. About 3 days out of the starting gate, the Chancellor was on her feet and talking about planning, and basically putting us front and centre in terms of the government's agenda. Less than about 3.5 weeks out of the starting gate, we put the NPPF out for consultation. And then it's quite important to note, the autumn statement and the commitment to funding to planning that came from the Chancellor. So that's about 4 months in, 6 months in, the Christmas present of the NPPF for real. And then in February, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And only a couple of weeks ago now, really, I was really delighted to be at the Planning Advisory Services annual conference with many planners from across local government in England. And at that point, we had basically just launched the PPG for green belts and grey belt, and also announced some significant funding for local authorities preparing both local plans and green belt assessments. And that's sort of to the tune of about £30 million. So if you sort of see that as a sort of run rate of change, it's very significant. And I'm sure we'll sort of get into the detail of what it means and what the period ahead looks like.
No, absolutely. Well, let's break down the broad references you've made to specifics. And first of all, December the 12th, the very important publication of the new NPPF. What is your feedback? What's your sense of it and the change that it's brought about in action?
I mean, it was a very clear commitment of the government in opposition, and then, as they came into power, to sort of say that they wanted to have a very pro-growth agenda and to some extent reset the balance between sort of basically housing numbers, place-based thinking, and seeing housing as part of the growth agenda. and saying to local authorities, this is your responsibility. This is a plan-led system. Within your plans, you should be addressing the growth that communities need. Do that in a very proactive way. Definitely do that in a sustainable way in terms of choices as to where you locate, but also recognizing that even where somewhere is quite constrained, particularly because of Greenbelt, that there was an opportunity to sort of think properly about land and growth and grow in a sustainable way. So quite a lot of really big moves. They're obviously sort of playing through the system. I think what we're sort of sensing that those changes are having an impact. I think everyone on this call is probably part of something that's going through its processes, whether it's an application or an appeal or looking at policy in a local plan. But it's important to see that as a sort of the sort of bookmark in what is, to Paul's point, quite a significant set of changes still to come. So if you really genuinely see this as a plan-led system, which I think we all believe in, then the next really important steps are towards moving towards that plan-led system, keeping the plans that are in the system going, hence the funding towards plans at Reg 18 and Reg 19, and then moving into a much more modernised system, which we can talk about. Those changes are ahead of us, and they're going to be really important and I think pretty exciting.
Well, let's segue into that, the proposed changes to development plan, because I think from our perspective, it is a time of change, a necessary change in development plans. I mean, we've all got councils who are frankly stagnating or for whatever reason are not pursuing plans. Tell us what is the likely roadmap over the next few months and years to reforms to the development plan, principally led in the legislation, the Lura Act, which is now Act, but certain elements will need to be obviously implemented and activated in the next year or so. So what do you see as the key changes to the development plan process, please, Joanna?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. And I think it's really important. We've got a bill that was now an Act. We've got a bill that's still a bill and going through its parliamentary processes. And it's what's really fascinating being in government is seeing that parliamentary process and then what comes after it. And in a sense, it is a big umbrella of reform in the planning system that's already within the Levelling Up Regeneration Act. And we then have to, in the order that ministers want to do it with their sort of finer grained decision making, then bring all of those things into fruition. So what you will have seen, and I would really encourage colleagues to look at it if you haven't had a chance. It's not very beautifully titled, but there's the Create and Update a Local Plan new bit on .gov. And what that is doing is starting to share, and it will iterate and it will build over time, the ideas about a new local plan system, what a new local plan should be in it, what's the time frame for its preparation and its examination and interface with the planning inspectorate, how you can look into doing things in a very proportionate way, how you can look at doing things in a very agile way in terms of community consultation and other aspects, and really sort of starting to pivot towards this sort of modernised local plan that is proportionate to the task at hand, really focuses on the important things, is not necessarily repeating or re-examining things that are set in national policy. So national development management policies will be a very important precursor to this process. And then sort of flowing that through. I mean, we all know the stats on local plan coverage. We all know, unfortunately, sort of people sort of being very selective as to whether they pursue a local plan and get it in place. And this is about sort of moving the dial significantly in terms of universal local plan coverage, and then obviously strategic planning that we can come to. So this is about meeting the needs of communities with a place-specific bespoke plan that's got political backing and community backing, and then sort of takes you into a sort of much more plan-led system.
But the fun from a planner, you speak as a planner, I completely understand that, but I think all of us on the ground, the concern we have is the lack of political will, the kind of numbers, which, I mean, we're talking about big numbers, but most councillors do get nervous when the headline in the local paper is new plan proposes as 15, 20, 25,000 houses. There is a political fear about how that will be perceived in the communities they represent. How does one get members buy-in to bringing forward up-to-date development plans under the new proposed system?
I think, well, to some extent, the consequences that bite from the NPPF before Christmas are meaningful. You know, if you don't have a plan, things you can't be in front of development and framing it and pointing it in the right direction. You're going to be behind the sort of curve in a way. So the logic of having a plan in place and setting out your stall and allocating enough land and talking about the infrastructure that's required to go with that housing and the other development that comes forward, having that holistic view, having a holistic view about landscape, for example, and public space and those other amenities. What is really fascinating, is when you look at the sort of responses that come from communities, everyone absolutely recognises that we need more homes and we need more quality homes, and we want to see neighbourhoods coming forward. They want to see it coming with infrastructure, and they want to see it coming forward well. That is how you do it. You do that through preparing a plan and then being able as a local authority to say, these are our parameters, this is what's important to us, come and do business, and we'll talk to, and we'll get things through the regulatory planning system. So I don't, I always sort of see it as a fascinating question when, major organisations and local authorities are major organisations. One of the primary things they do is think about the future of their place to meet the needs of their community. One of the most powerful ways they do that is through a local plan. What some of the work we're doing in terms of engagement is showing, particularly through digital engagement, when you get to people sort of in how they live their lives, whether it's online, whether it's, through a sort of social media, whether it's through engaging in many different ways, you get many more voices coming forward. And you get a much, much bigger representation of voices coming forward. So we're really going to lean into that in terms of, and we are ready in terms of supporting local authorities to reach out to communities in new ways and have that conversation. And just sort of start the dialogue. And there's nothing to stop local authorities doing that now. They don't need to wait for us to, say this is a new local plan. It's start the dialogue now, have that conversation about change.
Thank you. Now, the other element I wanted to talk about from Laura is obviously you've just mentioned it, the National Development Management Policies. Mm-hmm. I mean, broadly, the timetable and what I suppose one of the things I'm interested in, I'm sure others are, is the scope. I mean, is the coverage going to be pretty universal, or will they focus on particular areas?
So the way to think of it is that if you have a local plan and you're trying to, in a sense, keep that sort of focused on the issues that are local, and you're trying to sort of confirm and verify the things that are nationally prescribed and not therefore repeated within a local plan, then that obviously is a really important thing to get right and get out there before you launch a new local plan system. So you can see in timing terms that, whatever we do with the NPPF, and it is basically taking the NPPF and taking out those elements that are for development management and decision making, and those elements that are about preparing a local plan, and sort of doing a sort of disaggregation of that content and a clarification of that content for its specific purposes. So that's something it's obviously actively working on it. It's something obviously that we would be committed to consulting on. You're going to see it sort of before we bring out the new local plan system. So this is all sort of, in the mix in the sort of next 6 months and into the rest of this year. I mean, I obviously can't commit to sort of specific timetables, but, these are the sort of, they're two really big markers of the sort of new system that will come forward.
And is it envisaged there will be consultation on the proposed policies or not?
On national development management policies, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Then if you're content, shall we move on to the proposed planning and infrastructure bill, because there's quite a lot there. And I think in the light of Paul, just because I get so happy at the idea there'll be continued DCOs and the NSIP process, let's start off with that. Obviously, there's an intention to try and streamline and speed up the process. You've identified its importance. Just briefly, after some years in practice, what are the key areas that you're looking to change in relation to the NSIP and DCO process?
So the planning and infrastructure bill might have learned from somebody on this call. I don't know. Might have taken a few hints in terms of looking at the system. I mean, there's a few, again, sort of major moves that are sort of proposed in the legislation, and obviously more detail to come. The primary one is that the actual national policy that sets out the requirements and the demand case, the needs case for different types of infrastructure is kept up to date and updated more regularly, sort of basically every 5 years. And those documents are really fascinating because if you think about, say, energy infrastructure, then obviously technology is changing quite quickly, and also our demands are changing quite quickly. So I think if we all asked ourselves, did we really engage with data centers and think this was going to be a big deal, say 10 years ago, the answer would probably be like, yeah, maybe. But actually they are, for example, a huge demand on energy and need obviously quite serious connections and all the rest of it, and are quite vital to, for example, our gaming industry or many different new aspects of our economy. So the point being is that things change. So if you've got a national policy about a piece of infrastructure that's nationally significant, well, then that you've got to make sure it's up to date. And I think the other thing that is really interesting is that the MPSs also have to help both the applicant and the decision maker. So I actually chair something called the Quality Review Panel, which means I sort of get to sit with MPSs, review them with some really bright people, and sort of say, did these work as documents? And to my mind, I think there's this real opportunity to sort of, in the same way we're talking about local plans, give greater clarity to the applicant and a really great clarity to the decision maker, which all helps get better and faster decision making. And the other element that's really interesting is in the spatial space. So, you'll know that there's work going on, for example, in terms of strategic energy planning and making that more spatial. So over time, what's the sort of objective and how could we be more spatial in terms of looking at different forms of infrastructure that sit in the NSIT space? So those are all sort of things that all point to national policy needs to be agile, up to date, and kept up to date. The other two things I think I'd highlight as sort of major changes, which is to do a judicial review. So at the minute, there's sort of 3 bites at the cherry in terms of going through the courts. In simplest terms, the proposition in the bill is to say, if you literally have something which is by a judge is considered to not have merit as an argument for judicial review, you've got 1 bite and that's it, you're out. But if not, you can go on to sort of two judicial review processes rather than, sort of everyone having potentially three goes at it. So that's again about sort of, making that sort of opportunity to challenge proportionate. And so all of these things are all about sort of speeding up the system, getting better decision making, and just making it much clearer for both the applicant and the decision maker.
Thank you. Now, another element I wanted to talk to you about, which is highly topical, obviously, is nature recovery and the approach to development and how it deals with nature recovery, particularly on a more strategic level. I think all of us know each application and appeal is incredibly subjective in the approach to nature recovery, issues of BNG, nutrient neutrality, etc., etc. What is the aspiration in order of changing the system to get a more uniform and kind of consistent approach?
Yeah, so before Christmas and in the run up to the PIP, we consulted on the idea of having a nature recovery fund and a sort of infrastructure that sit around that. And then within the bill, it talks about so in order to have a fund, you have to have a system of actually establishing what is the impact on nature. What actually are you judging to be the things that need to be addressed across a sort of series of developments in relation to nature? And then what might you charge as a levy to then sort of build up that fund and how that fund is then distributed to deal with those impacts. I think it's really important at the starting point on this to underline that the system would be, overseen, and the creation of an environmental delivery plan as outlined in the bill would have to be sort of the plan itself would have to be approved. And therefore it's not a sort of get out of jail card, which is, I don't fancy doing any mitigation, I'll just go straight to this option. It's very much going to be where it's needed and where it will actually bring benefit to nature and will make a difference and will, be the appropriate form of mitigation for development. And the way to see it is a system to sort of take a geography where you've got an issue playing out, like nutrient neutrality. You can look at it, and you need to look at it at a bigger geography. You need to look at it in a comprehensive way. Because an individual development can't necessarily address it sufficiently in terms of mitigation. And then you look at it across that geography, you figure out what mitigation is required, you figure out what a levy payment would be, and then that goes into a pot, and then that is used to do the mitigation. So it's quite a big new proposition. Obviously, colleagues in Natural England and DEFRA will be working to describe that, design it and define it. But it's a way of basically both enabling the infrastructure, homes and things to come forward, but to be strategic and targeted at the same time as to how it then addresses the sort of sensitive natural environments and all those mitigations that are required. So you sort of get the development, but you also get a sort of certainty of funding and a certainty of mitigation actually going on across a geography. And what's really fascinating about it is you might take a geography and be dealing with a number of issues that are playing out. And all credit to colleagues in Natural England, they're really forward leaning and sort of wanting to take the strategic approach rather than the sort of piece by meal approach to say whether it's newts or whatever the issue might be, and be much more sort of fulsome in how we consider these issues in the round.
Thank you. Now, two other topics before I invite the other panelists to ask you a question. Two other topics I just want to finish on. The first, of course, is fundamental to all of us, is the process of determination at local level. And of course, the future role and involvement of councillors. Can you just describe what your aims and aspirations are in relation to changing how it's currently done?
Yeah, so ultimately, the bill, and again, there was a sort of working paper that sort of talked about this in advance of the bill. The bill is sort of allowing ministers to make a decision about a national scheme of delegation. What does that mean? It basically means the ability for national government to say, we're going to sort of set parameters, thresholds, conditions under which certain planning applications are either considered at committee or are delegated to officers. And that's to some extent all that the bill does. It basically just sets the ability of national government to do that. It will be for ministers to decide exactly what that looks like. But I suppose what's in our minds is about making sure councillors, having, again, going back to this point about the local plan, having invested in the local plan, having set out their stall, having been clear about expectations. Sometimes you'll have something that doesn't need to be relitigated at planning committee, whether that's a household extension or a very minor development. Or sometimes you might have something that's already been considered a fairly full outline, and you're looking at reserved matters and conditions, and maybe that's something that should just be delegated. These are all for future decisions, all for ministers to decide, but you can kind of see where you can make sure elected councillors are focusing on those big strategic choices, and then investing in the local plan and all those big decisions, and actually importantly, the big strategic decisions as well. But sometimes it may be that other things can be left to officers. So that's all got to play through. There's no defined method at the moment.
Okay, and the other thing I just wanted to ask you about, and Paul will love this question because it's one of his bugbears or hobby horses, however you define it, and that is the emergence of strategic planning and the evolution of, and frankly, endorsement of a more strategic approach to the planning system. What is envisaged in relation to that, please, Joanna?
Yeah, so if you take the working principle of not repeating, at different tiers, which I think we'll all agree is probably something quite sensible, then what you look at in strategic planning is what do you need to do at a strategic level at more than local. So again, all sort of being worked on at the minute, and again, some great inputs from colleagues who have been thinking about this. So there's two sort of aspects that are worth sort of pointing out. One is the geography at which strategic planning will happen, and then is what is the plan. So on the geography point, obviously local government reorganisation is sort of in its sort of emerging stages. That will mean a changing geography of local government across the country. There's a lot of local authorities implicated in that, but what it basically means is that you'll have sort of metropolitan authorities, mayoral combined authorities, and as we know, some of those are already planning authorities, and a number of them are preparing strategic plans. What the bill does is actually set that as a duty. So it's not if you fancy it, why not do it? It's like this is one of your kind of core functions. And worth saying, just as an aside, that the bill also, all the expectation is through legislation that mayoral combined authorities could also become decision-making authorities for major applications. So that sort of geography is known, and that sort of governance is fairly well known and familiar if you take London as a context. For the rest of the country, you're going to probably have a pattern of combined authorities and unitaries, or county combined authorities, which is basically a greater level of unitarisation across the country. But strategic planning will happen even a tier above that. So what the bill enables the government to do is basically set up strategic planning boards, which would sit at a bigger geography than even potentially, a county and a unitary city beside it, and then prepare an SDS. And I think, the emergent thinking is an SDS should be, tight and targeted in terms of what it needs to do. We have a great ability to do something in a very digitally enabled way. It should definitely speak to infrastructure requirements. One assumes it should also talk to the very aspects of land, what is urban, what is peri-urban, what is greenbelt, what is protected, where are things actually important from different landscape functions, and then, sort of do the really important job of allocating the housing. But it does more than that. It also sort of says, here's the shape of growth and here's the shape of where the economy might be growing. So it's making those big strategic moves. But it also, I think our thinking is also that it should be a document that's tight and sharp, and definitely digitally enabled. So those are just early thoughts, much more to come. Ministers will, obviously think through, what they want from that system and what the design of it is, but sort of early thinking. As you'll have seen, and lots of speculation about it going on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thea, your question, please, for Joanna.
Thanks, Sasha, and hello, Joanna. So my question is about flood risk and particular flood risk policy that requires sequential site assessments to be done in respect of surface water flooding, which we know is ubiquitous. And I wonder if government's aware of the issues and the delay that that's causing, and if so, what's proposed to be done about it?
Yes, we are more than aware. And I'm afraid sometimes when I'm in conversations, I have to say, just wait a bit longer, please, and all will be revealed. This is one of those things, but, we're definitely on it. And, the sort of confirmation and clarification will be sort of coming forward in PPG, including, how you sort of look at sequential testing and stuff like that. And so that's sort of forthcoming, yeah. I mean, we've talked about big moves, but there's lots of other things obviously in play at the same time. So that's one of them.
I think that's going to be music to lots and lots. And it's not just the ones here, but all over the country. Thank you.
Chris.
Yes. My question is, what does the government need to do to get to 1.5 million homes by July 2029?
That's such a good question. I keep that one for the minister. I think my reflection is that, looking at the housing system and the planning system's role in it is how it is being considered. So I think it's always worth looking at it in that regard, because the planning system is the route by which we bring forward land and we decide what is permitted and what isn't permitted, and we make sure that development doesn't just mitigate its negative impacts but also contributes to broader community need. Broader, I don't need to state that, but I mean that isn't the end of it. There are many other things besides that need to be addressed to deliver 1.5. So I'm sure you've picked up, but there've been lots of really important statements made about affordable housing programme, for example, and commitments to funding in the autumn statement, and then a very recent commitment to another 2 billion. And so, making sure that affordable housing and that aspect of the market is got certain, a degree of certainty, even in advance of the spending review, is really important. There's other aspects that are partly in planning policy, but also more broadly about diversification of the market and basically all players coming forward. We broadly have a housing delivery system that's very reliant on volume house builders, so private sector housing building, whereas actually, this government's very clear that it wants as many actors as possible to be in the housing market and delivering. That includes SMEs, that includes housing associations and also councils. So what you'll see is sort of us moving not just on planning, which is one aspect of it, but the sort of planning system, the housing system across the piece. And in that regard, it's quite important work done from the summer onwards, which was to do with something called the New Homes Accelerator, which was, again, asking people from across the sector, what is it that's actually holding up your existing permissions as well? So the schemes that not just those that are coming through planning, but those that are already in play. And through that, a very important set of feedback loops to sort of say, okay, these are the other things that are sort of tripping us up as we go through the system. And then, working in that space, particularly with, brilliant colleagues in Homes England, to look at unlocking housing schemes that should be coming forward, should be delivering. So I think I can sort of reassure you that we are looking at it in a genuinely systemic way, and looking at schemes that have got their planning, should be happening, right the way through to things that are in planning, and then stuff that's way pre-planning in terms of land. And New Towns is very much in that space, schemes that will probably be delivering back end and into next Parliament, but unless you plan them and start mobilising for them, you're going to find it difficult to deliver. So we are sort of taking that sort of very systemic approach. And one thing I think is interesting, in the NPPF, it doesn't get talked about very much, but there's quite an important paragraph that talks about local authorities looking at their housing tenure mix, and being proactive in planning for the right tenure mix for their communities. And if you take that alongside the updates in the NPPF about social rent and other forms of affordable, then that sort of whole tenure diversification is actually now quite strong within the planning system. And I think we'll see that sort of flowing through more and more as sort of time goes on.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you.
Charlie.
Thanks, Sasha. Joanna, I wanted to ask you about the planning inspectorate. Clearly, its workload is increasing and going to increase. I asked one inspector, who shall remain anonymous, does the inspector have the bandwidth to deal with it? And they said, of course not. And I suspect that's probably right, to be quite honest. One can see anecdotally the timescales are slipping. There are things, I think they would deny it, but most people would have illustrations, examples of cases which should really be hearings or inquiries have been downgraded to written reps, etc. So really my question is, does the inspector require greater resourcing to deal with their increased workload? What might that look like? And is there something in the pipeline from government to assist with this?
Well, you'll know, Charlie, we're all sort of subject to spending rounds, and obviously we've just started the spending round, which was the sort of full year, and the money was committed in the autumn. And then the next spending round will be, if you take this as sort of full year 1, and then you go into years 2, 3 and 4. So the spending round for years 2, 3 and 4 will come forward from the Chancellor sort of in the early summer. And that will set everybody's budgets, including, our budget as a department. I mean, every budget there is across government, including planning inspectorate. And I think we work incredibly closely with the planning inspectorate, as you'd imagine. And as we sort of stand up different aspects of this change programme, then we work with them because they are absolutely critical to this kind of overarching change and mission. Whether that's, the gateway system for local plans, whether that's the 150 DCOs, so we're very, very conscious of the pressures we put on them. But I just want to say also the pressures we put on local authorities as well. And we were really delighted in the autumn to get funding to support local government through this change programme. And, we did really, we got a really good outcome there to say this isn't just you do the legislation, you put the PPG out and you stand back and watch, but actually how do we support local government through that change? And whether that's through the work we fund PAS to do, Planning Advisory Service, or the work we might do directly, we do see this as a kind of change and implementation programme that doesn't happen because we say it's so. And obviously PINs are absolutely mission critical to everything that we do.
Thank you.
Paul.
Joanna, can I lift the curtain in terms of what happens behind the scenes for us? And then I'm going to ask you to lift the curtain for what happens behind the scenes for you. We have a phenomenal set of questions and comments made by our viewers, which we'll get Rob to send across to you so you can have a look at those and read those at your leisure. Lots of intelligent questions, and then only followed by a direct message from Charlie to me, which is, why are you wearing a stick of rock rather than a tie? Cheers, Charlie. Bless you for that. So my question is, lift the curtain in terms of what happens behind the scenes, because as Thea's mentioned, we have promises of reforms which we think are really well needed, like bringing out NPPF. So why do sometimes these things take a little bit longer than we might hope as frontline practitioners?
I think what's it's quite interesting, and I'm quite open about this. I've worked around Whitehall since the beginning of my career, and sometimes really quite close to it. I mean, I remember, forgive me if I've told you the story before, but there's a Pret-a-Manger down on Marsham Street. And I remember being in it in 1991, 92, when it was a little Italian, really nice restaurant, and coming to Marsham Street when it was old Marsham Street, and you went up the escalators and you walked into rooms actually with David Locke at the time, and there were pictures of airplanes on the wall. Anyway, but even when you've been in and around Whitehall, it isn't until you come into Whitehall that you can really understand how the sort of rhythm and the rhythm of it works. And at the end of the day, we are an incredibly busy department, working on one of government's kind of key agendas to support economic growth. And we sort of move through, the decisions and the processes as expedient as we can. There's just an awful lot of it. As we know, the planning system has many different aspects to it. And to some extent, what we've done is just layer an awful lot of complexity on top of a lot of complexity over the last decades. So you just have to systematically work through it. And that takes time, is the short answer.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you very much, Paul. Joanna, can I thank you, as usual, for an incredibly comprehensive, detailed and accessible summary of what's going on. Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed, Sasha. My thanks to Joanna. Every single time you come on, you fill us with huge insight, and it's a real privilege to hear directly from those involved at the very top of what government's doing. So thank you.
Can I give you one really optimistic sort of point? And I think this is so good. So our Pathways to Planning programme that the LGA and Planning Advisory Service run for us is recruiting planners into local authorities, okay? We basically pay for the education. At the minute, we're even doing a little bit of salary funding as well. We're on cohort 3. There were 2,100 applicants. These are not planning graduates. These are graduates who are interested in coming into planning all over the country. So I think there's this moment where we've got this, we are front of the headlines. I mean, it is astonishing. We should all feel, not just because of that, but because we're doing something really important. And it changes sort of, the economy, how people live, the opportunities available to them, their lifestyles, their well-being. So let's just keep saying that and, bring lots of really great people into the sector and find solutions and ways through things. So whoever said it was right, this is all about common sense planning and having, a way through these things and not getting too stuck in the legalities, candidly.
I love the fact that you mentioned repeatedly geography in your answers. Yeah. There's 2,000 graduates you could pick up every year.
Yeah. And the law graduates as well.
Law graduates, that's true. Thanks very much. We can't finish without mentioning that Arsenal beat Real Madrid 3-0. 3-0. I mean, Aston Villa fared a little less well against Paris Saint-Germain, but Sasha, 3-0 against Real Madrid. Unbelievable.
That was going to be my big number.
Maybe that's the explanation Paul's tie. It's like an Arsenal-coloured rock.
No, this is my second string for last week at Jonathan's. It's a Liverpool tie.
Best.
West Bromwich Albion are getting nowhere near that code.
No way. Joanna, thank you again.
Pleasure.
Thank you to our viewers. We're taking a break now until our 5th anniversary special on the 8th of May. So can you believe it's been 5 years? So we very much look forward to that. In the meantime, enjoy the sunshine while it lasts. Probably won't, but enjoy it while it lasts, and enjoy your Easter break.